Good day. Just to remind you again, before I start this program properly, that if you're watching us on Rumble, watching either the Duran or one of my videos or one of Alex Christofori's videos, you can find a red maroon button at the top of the video. If you press it, that will take you directly to our locals page, where we have an active and thriving community which you can join. And you can also join me for my live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Now let's proceed with the video. Last night, yesterday, when I did my previous video, there'd been a debate at the Russian Security Council. It looked as if the Russians were moving towards recognizing the independence of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. I suggested that perhaps Putin would take the line of waiting a couple of days to see whether the negotiations, the diplomacy initiated by President Macron would come to any conclusion, would achieve any result. But in the event, he decided that he would move ahead and recognize the two people's republics right away. And that decision was made last night. And over the course of the day, there's been further decisions by the Russian Parliament, the Duma, to recognize friendship treaties, to ratify friendship treaties with the two people's republics, and also to authorize President Putin to send troops abroad, abroad meaning in this case, I presume, the territory of the two people's republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. So, as I understand it, by the way, those troops, despite some reports that one may have seen, those troops have not yet been deployed to the republics, at least not so far, but I presume that they will be, and it is only a question of time. Now, all of this news has provoked radically different reactions. In fact, not just radically different reactions, we are once again in that uncomfortable and somewhat disoriented world where one contemplates two completely different information spaces where there is almost no overlap between them. In the West, this move has been interpreted as a first step towards this much talked about, much threatened invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And there's been some attempts to construe Vladimir Putin's long speech, which he gave to the Russian people from his office yesterday, as saying that he doesn't consider Ukraine to be a legitimate state, and implying that perhaps that indicates that he is indeed contemplating precisely that sort of invasion. And there's been a flurry of condemnations. There's been all kinds of criticisms. The European Union has talked about one of the darkest pages in modern history. Overblown language, in my opinion. I mean, it's not the first time borders have been changed unilaterally. The Western powers launched a war against Yugoslavia in 1999 without authorization from the Security Council. They bombed Yugoslavia for, I believe it was 74 days. They managed to insert an occupation force into the breakaway Yugoslav Republic of Kosovo, and in violation of the terms of a Security Council resolution which ended the war, they proceeded later on to recognize Kosovo as an independent country. So there is that precedent, not one I've noticed that Western governments want to remember. And of course, going back further to the mid-1970s, in 1974, following a coup in Cyprus, which overthrew the democratically elected President Mercouris, the Turkey sent an occupying force into northern Cyprus. It occupied 40% of Cypriot territory. The Greek population of northern Cyprus was driven out or evacuated, and a new entity, the Republic of Northern Cyprus, essentially under Turkish control, was created, and of course it still exists. In the Greek world, from which after all I come, claims that what has happened in Ukraine is somehow original and unprecedented and extraordinary, cut very little ice indeed. They simply demonstrate the extraordinarily short and selective memory span of Western officials. Anyway, there has been lots of condemnation, and there's been the inevitable sanctions. Now, I have discussed in earlier programs how I felt that perhaps one of the purposes of this extraordinary campaign that has been orchestrated, there's been run for months, ever since October, in fact, was to try to pressure the Germans into cancelling the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Well, the Germans have essentially done that. So that part, if you like, of the project has succeeded. I say they've cancelled the pipeline. Strictly speaking, they suspended its certification, so it could, in theory, be restarted at some point. But I have to say that the political cost of doing so for any German chancellor who contemplates it will be extremely high. So anyway, we'll see what happens. But to repeat a point I have said many times about this, is Germany that asked for Nord Stream 2. The Russians were very skeptical about the whole idea. They very grudgingly agreed to build it. They did eventually build it. I think they've long since regretted that decision. Their major focus are the new pipelines that they're building to China. They've already built one. 2 more are in the process of construction. The second one is going to be enormous, and that is where Russian natural gas is now increasingly going to flow. Germany's decision to drop Nord Stream 2 will result in Germany paying higher prices for its gas, and of course it's going to be doing that. It's going to be dispensing with Russian gas at a time when gas reserves in Europe's underground gas system are at critically low levels, and where the capacity to import liquefied natural gas is now almost a total saturation. So it'll be interesting to see how much enthusiasm there is for this decision as gas prices across Europe start to surge, and perhaps as gas shortages start to build, with a prospect of particular problems starting to escalate next winter. And I would say, with a very real prospect that they were going to escalate still further, given that it must now be almost a certainty that pipeline gas from Russia via Ukraine is going to stop soon also. But anyway, there's been that decision on Nord Stream 2. All of the other sanctions that we've been hearing about so far, well, they've not been announced to any degree. The British have sanctioned 5 small banks, or at least 5 banks in Russia, which I've never heard of before, and which were certainly not the big state banks that people are talking about. There's been sanctions against Russian MPs, which of course they're not going to take particularly seriously. No doubt there will be more sanctions coming, but so far I have to say the sanctions that have been rolled out have been fairly minor affair. But anyway, this has been the Western reaction to these events. This is a massive infringement of Ukraine's sovereignty, a great, a dark and terrible act, an act of aggression against what Boris Johnson somewhat extraordinarily referred to as a peaceful country. That has been the Western narrative. The Russian narrative is, of course, profoundly different. And here I really have to explain something, which is something which I suspect will take many people in the West by surprise, which is that the Russian explanation for this move, the Russian explanation for the decision to recognize the two people's republics, is to avoid war. The theory is that since Ukraine was clearly on the brink of mounting another military offensive against the two republics, one which Russia has no option but to oppose, and which would have resulted in sanctions coming anyway when Russia did, and which, if Russia had waited too long, would have resulted in massive fighting with hundreds and perhaps thousands of people killed. What the Russians have done is that they have preempted that Ukrainian offensive, which they see as coming, and the evidence for which they see in the shelling, the heavy shelling that was taking place over the weekend, that they have preempted that attack, that offensive, by recognizing the two people's republics and by forewarning the Ukrainians that if they were to launch such an offensive, they would be up against the Russian army. So from a Russian point of view, the purpose of this is to preserve, well, let's not call it peace, but let's say a regime of silence or some kind of a ceasefire in what used to be eastern Ukraine. And that is how this move is being represented to the Russian people. Of course, it's clear, it has become increasingly clear, that the Russians are recognizing the two republics on the basis of their constitutions. The constitutions of the two republics make it clear that they claim jurisdiction not just over the territories that they control, but over the entirety of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, the regions of Lugansk that had been drawn up by the Soviet Union and which are still the regions or provinces in which countries like Russia and Ukraine are subdivided. And of course, around half of the territory of these two regions, of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, is under the control of Ukraine. So very understandably, there is some nervousness in the West and indeed around the world that the Russians will take action at some point over the next few days or perhaps weeks to drive the Ukrainians out of these regions. I personally think that is unlikely. I think if the Ukrainians are reckless enough to launch an invasion, an offensive against the two republics of the Donbass, which, to say it frankly, they might do. I don't think they will, but there are some very strange decision makers in Ukraine. In that event, the Russian army would, of course, take rapid action to parry that offensive, and the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, 60,000 men apparently, would be quickly defeated and destroyed. And then in that case, I think the Russians probably would push on and would bring all of the territories of the two regions back under the control of Donetsk and Lugansk. At which point, as I understand it, Ukraine would have lost around a quarter of its territory. But I don't think that is what the Russians are immediately planning to do. I think that having made this move, they're now going to hope that the situation will at least calm, and they're still working towards this meeting with Secretary Blinken on Thursday, this meeting between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov, which has been talked about and discussed, and which, very interestingly, the Americans so far have not called off. So there we go. We have a situation when the Russians have made a very, very big move They've recognized these two republics. They've indicated their readiness to send their peacekeepers there. I'm sure they will do within the next few days or hours. And they will parry a Ukrainian offensive. But I don't personally think that they're going to take any further offensive moves. And so far, on the Western side, despite all the extraordinary talk, all the dramatic language, the debates in the House of Commons in London, the angry words in Brussels, the decision in Germany to cancel Nord Stream 2, all of those sort of things, so far, the Western reaction has been a lot more measured than one might think. I'm not sure that will continue, by the way. The sense of hysteria that exists in the West is so overwhelming that I have to say that it's quite likely, plausible even, that the West will be swept along by its own hysteria and will start doing things which perhaps it would be unwise for it to do. Of course, if it were to go all the way and impose all the sanctions that it's talking about, well, then, of course, Russian hands are freed, and no doubt the Russians might decide to take more forceful moves. They might also, by the way, start taking further moves to try to restrict exports of their own to the West. And there's been an interesting article by Ambrose Evans-Pritchard in the Daily Telegraph, who's been obviously doing very hard work unpacking this whole issue of sanctions, in which he's basically conceded a point which I have made on many previous occasions, which is that Russia already produces enough microchips to cover its needs. It's not able to produce microchips at the very top end of the spectrum, the kind needed to launch, say, 5G technologies. That I have to say that given Russia's enormous technological skills, I've no doubt they could do that, and probably very quickly. But anyway, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard thinks that if there was an attempt to block microchip sales to the Russians, they would rapidly adapt to this. They have enough microchip production to cover their essential needs, and it would probably slow them down by perhaps 2 or 3 years, which doesn't look very impressive. And that doesn't even take into account, apparently, whatever help they might receive from China along the way. By contrast, the Russians apparently have a lock grip on many of the metals that are essential for production of high-end technology products, including, interestingly, microchips. And perhaps even more interestingly, Ukraine also plays quite a role in providing exports of some of these high-end metal products. And if the Russians were to start interrupting export of these high-end metals, that might actually, according to Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, wreck production of microchips across the industrialized Western world, or including, of course, when I say the Western world, I include countries like South Korea and Taiwan. And Ambrose Evans-Pritchard goes on to say that this is something that has only very recently been understood by the US government. It's only recently been informed about this, something I find astonishing, by the way, and which reinforces my feeling that we have essentially amateurs in charge of things in Washington and elsewhere. But anyway, coming to all of this, if radical sanctions are imposed, if we have this surge of sanctions dropping, well, what we will certainly see in that case is energy prices explode. We will see food prices explode. The Russians might take retaliatory measures with all these metals that Ambrose Evans-Pritchard was talking about, and other technologies and supply chain issues. And that might create major problems, apparently, in chip production, which could be extremely disruptive. And then, of course, we would see what happens and how Western governments respond to the critical problems in which they would then face. At least that is the prospect that Ambrose Evans Pritchard lays out before us. Regardless, I think this is a key moment in European and world affairs. It's now quite clear to me that we are in the advanced stage of an extremely disruptive and chaotic process in Europe, but one which I suspect will be eventually navigated through, and which will in time, we're talking about a couple of years, result in perhaps a more stable equilibrium. This advance eastward by the West of the EU and of NATO has now run up against a Russian brick wall. The Russians are pushing back. Putin made it again crystal clear in his speech, his address to the Russian people, that for Russia, Ukraine joining NATO is an existential matter, something which Russia is going to stop and prevent from happening. And so that process of eastward expansion of NATO and of the EU has essentially ground to a stop. More importantly, despite the fact that, as I said, I don't think the Russians have any immediate designs on Ukraine. I don't think they're looking to extend the territory they control. I think that from a Russian perspective, these moves were, as I said, intended to prevent a war, not to start one. I think that nonetheless, what we have seen, it's difficult to construe what we have seen as anything else than a further step in the step-by-step disintegration of Ukraine. Now, Putin gave a very long speech, which has been ridiculed in much of the Western media. People have talked about it as rambling and as a rant and all of those things, and they said that it showed a paranoid personality, one steeped in grievances and all of those sort of things. My own impression of it is that it was a very typical speech of the sort that Russian leaders frequently make. There is a huge discordance in political rhetoric between Russia and the West. Russian speeches, political speeches, tend to be extremely didactic and, as I said, very heavily historically laden when discussing these sort of topics. Putin's speeches in this respect are no different from Russian speeches generally. If you go back all the way, for example, to the Second World War, you will find that Stalin's speeches at that time during the war were very similar in that respect. In the sense that they were didactic and historically driven. So I think that is all I would say about Putin's speech. I think it was fairly standard in Russian rhetorical terms. But what Putin did do, and I think he was absolutely right to point this out, even though many Westerners find this very difficult to accept or contemplate, he did point out what an artificial construct Ukraine is within its 2013 borders. There is a core region in Ukraine, what you might call the former Tsarist region of Ukraine, the area around Kiev and the small towns and cities around it. Then there is a block of eastern territory, territory in the east and along the Black Sea, which were predominantly Russian-speaking, and which was distinct from Tsarist-era Ukraine. And then there is a western region which was added to Ukraine by Stalin during the war, which had previously been a Habsburg and then a Polish province where people speak Ukrainian. And unlike the Ukrainians of central Ukraine, they are not Orthodox, but follow the Catholic or Uniate churches. So the point Putin was making is that this is a cobbled together territory which, because of certain decisions made by Ukrainian leaders since they gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, has failed to cohere into a single nation state. Policies have been followed which, instead of consolidating Ukraine, have tended to fragment it and to set the various sections of Ukraine in opposition against each other. And I have to say that though this is a narrative, a historical account of Ukraine, which Westerners passionately reject, even as they appear to me to know extremely little about the country, it is a narrative, a historical view of Ukraine, which I think has essential truth behind it. I think that what has now happened, the fact that another Ukrainian region, the Donbass, after Crimea, has successfully broken away from Ukraine, is now no longer a part of Ukraine, is gradually and inexorably going to create a chain reaction. Now, I say that with no pleasure. I'm not someone who likes to see countries disintegrate, and I want to make that very clear at the outset. But I cannot see now how this process can be prevented except by the further use of extraordinary force. And the danger is that if that kind of force is now used by whatever Ukrainian government continues to function after this affair, with Russia now in effect committed to defending the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, something again, by the way, which I think the Russians had not set out to do originally, but which through popular sentiment in their own country and through the complex nature of Ukrainian and Russian politics, they have found themselves doing, with the Russians committed now to defending the rights of Russian speakers in places like Ukraine. Once that chain reaction starts to gain momentum, it will be very difficult indeed for the Russians not to lend support to it. So at that point, we are going to start to see, probably over a very protracted period, certainly not immediately, but gradually, further moves towards the breakdown of this country. Now, let me say again, I say this with no pleasure. It's not something I contemplate with any joy, but objectively, I think that is what is going to happen. And the further that this happens, the more it seems to me that the political geometry of Europe is going to change. And it's perhaps worth saying that already there have been two key events over the last 2 years that have already affected the shift in Europe's political geometry. Firstly, there was the failure of the Colour Revolution attempt and of the subsequent coup attempt in Belarus to overthrow Lukashenko's government, with the result that Belarus is now becoming rapidly integrated into the Russian economic, political and military system, something I have discussed in previous programs. And it now looks increasingly as if Kazakhstan, which is the other core country, the other core territory that made up the former Soviet Union, it was a major agricultural and industrial region, it's very rich in minerals, that also is now becoming increasingly tied to the Russians, to Russia as well. So with all of these territories, with these two republics now gradually becoming more tightly integrated into the Russian system, with Donbass undoubtedly going in the same direction, with Crimea, of course, already lost to Ukraine, and with other regions in Ukraine perhaps becoming increasingly disaffected and unstable, and perhaps looking to break away from Ukraine in due course, we are going to start to see a gradual resurgence of Russian power in Eastern Europe. Already, I've been reading articles in the Financial Times about how the link-up of Belarus with Russia has made the position of the Baltic states practically undefendable. So this is going to, in the short term, obviously increase tensions. And there will be enormous alarm in Europe about these developments. But eventually, over time, I believe that some sort of modus vivendi will be achieved. Maybe we will not have friendship, but I think at some point, again, it will take several years to play out. The Western powers will gradually come to terms with what has happened. At that point, we will start to see, finally, negotiations, serious negotiations taking place between the Russians and the Western powers to sort out the security architecture of Europe. It will take a while for this to happen, but I think that is the trajectory of travel eventually. It repeats in many respects what happened during the Cold War. During the Cold War, there were periods of intense tension during the 1950s, especially during the period between 1958 and 63, when the Russians also felt that there was serious problems in the West, but also felt that their own military power was growing. And after this extremely serious period of tension, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the building of the Berlin Wall, the detonation of the gigantic Soviet Tsar bomb, hydrogen bomb, the shooting down of Gary Powers and his U-2, all of those things. Eventually, in the mid-1960s, a process began known as détente, which aimed to achieve a relaxation of tensions. And I think eventually that is where we will get to. We have a difficult and complex period ahead of us. And it must also be said that one of the great problems is that whereas in the 60s, political leadership in the West was of an extremely high standard, today political leadership in the West, well, shall we say it politely, leaves a great deal to be desired. But I think that is the trajectory of travel. We're going to have a very difficult, very unstable period over the next couple of years. We're going to see a steady build-up of Russian military power in Europe. We're going to see more problems and crises in Ukraine over the next few years. But eventually, those serious negotiations to sort out Europe's security architecture will come, and at that point, we will start to see something which, if not exactly peace in Europe, will at least be a period of, shall we say, tranquility and stability in which people will finally have space to get on with their lives. Anyway, that's my general take of what's happened. Obviously, this has been a rather more, shall I say, generalized discussion of the latest events. Obviously, this particular crisis with Ukraine has some way to play itself out. We'll no doubt see whether or not Blinken and Lavrov do indeed meet over the next few days, and we'll see what the West actually does when it comes to sanctions and what counter-sanctions, if any, the Russians impose in retaliation. But anyway, that is my own take on these events, and we will see whether in future, though it might take a long time to know one way or the other for sure, we will see whether in the end I'm right. Thank you for joining me again for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. And of course, don't forget to look up the channel of my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And also, please remember to check us out on our platforms, our other platforms. I've already spoken about Rumble and Locals, and you find links under this video. But you will also be able to find us on other platforms like ODYSEE and SuperU, and other platforms as well. And of course, if you want to support us, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweet t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And of course, if you want to show, if you like this video, you can press the like button, and please anyway, check your subscription to this channel. So, as I said, a contemplative video today, one that attempts to look perhaps a little further into the future than most of the videos I do. No doubt tomorrow we will be back to normal, discussing the latest cut and thrust in the diplomatic battle. Thank you very much for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. And until then, have a very good day.